Welcome back, everyone. It's Charlie. Reportedly, Henry Cavill has already been offered and signed on to play a major new Marvel character. A lot of you have been fan casting him in a couple of different roles like Sentry, Hyperion, Captain Britain. So I know there's tons of questions. He definitely seems more available than he was in previous years. He's talked about joining the MCU in the past, so we'll break it all down. Because DC's loss is Marvel's gain. If you're brand new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to get all the videos. There's a bunch of big stuff coming up, particularly X-Men 97, like we just got the Deadpool and Wolverine trailer. It is like prime X-Men time in the MCU this year.
Is that supposed to be scary? Pegging isn't new for me, friendo, but it is for Disney.
But you may have seen the news in your feeds recently. It looks like Henry Cavill has already signed on to play a secret Marvel character, and it seems like it's going to be a version of Captain Britain. He'd previously talked about doing Captain Britain in the MCU way back before he found out that he'd been recast as Superman in the DC movies. How ironic that he would then be offered and sign on to play a character. He said being Captain Britain would be loads of fun to do, cool modernized version of that, like the way they modernized Captain America, Steve Rogers' Captain America. There's something fun about that, and I do love being British. I think at the time he was doing his interview talking about Captain Britain, that he was just trying to say that he was open to anything in the Marvel Universe if he were available, but then cut to a couple years later, James Gunn gets hired by Warner Brothers to revive the DC Universe. He decides to completely reboot the main Justice League actors, including Superman. Normally, Marvel DC probably wouldn't have a problem with actors doing movies from competing brands like that at the same time. But usually that's just for smaller characters like background characters, voiceover actors whose faces you don't see in every single movie, not for like the biggest A-list characters like Superman. But what he's talking about is doing Captain Britain set in present day. Think like Henry Cavill in Man from U.N.C.L.E. or during the Mission Impossible movies, that sort of modern day type of hyperkinetic action, but with him running around swinging a sword. And speaking of fantasy-based characters, most of you might remember Henry Cavill before he became Superman in the Man of Steel movie in the DC movies. He played a British lord during the Tudors series, swinging a sword around. And most of you have been watching him as Geralt the Witcher on The Witcher Netflix, so everyone toss a coin to your Captain Britain. Also, what a coincidence that he's no longer playing Geralt heading forward with the Witcher universe. That was a huge bummer, but essentially he's trading the Witcher Netflix for his own Warhammer series and movies, which I would call an upgrade, so things are actually looking pretty good for him. Warhammer is also a totally different genre that really doesn't compete with Marvel, so there's no real conflict there with him doing Warhammer and Marvel stuff too. And when he says modernize the Captain Britain character, the main version of Captain Britain, Brian Braddock, was created in the 1970s, so a lot of adventures that he had traded on major pop culture events of that era. That's also why they had that really cool Avengers Endgame Easter egg for Captain Britain during the time heist mission to the 1970s. When Iron Man and Captain America went back to Camp Lehigh in the 1970s to steal the Tesseract, Captain America is searching the offices for Pym particles to steal so they can return back to present day. He stumbles into an office only to see that it's Peggy Carter's S.H.I.E.L.D. office on the base, and they play for this really dramatic moment. He gets really sad thinking about how much he loves her. And as he watches her walk in from the other side of the glass, trying to stay hidden, she mentions Agent Braddock, and that's meant to be a reference for Brian Braddock, who became Captain Britain in the 1970s. And even though this is a very Captain America kind of scene, Captain Britain is not just a British version of Captain America. He doesn't have the whole man out of time thing going for him, being from the 1940s, frozen in ice for over 70 years. When he was created, he was meant to be a character from present day who was just part of this ancient line, kind of like the Black Knight. But speaking of Peggy Carter, talking about that Avengers Endgame scene, during the What If episodes that I did videos for recently, we kind of got a multiverse version of Peggy Carter, Captain Britain, with the costume. But the way they played the character, she was more like Captain America, just wearing a Captain Britain-looking costume, than being a straight-up Captain Britain, just because his backstory is so different from Captain America's backstory. In my opinion, it was a big missed opportunity for some cool Easter eggs. The big connection to the Eternals movie, so Captain Britain's backstory is a little bit like Dane Whitman's Black Knight backstory. Kit Harington's going to be playing in the MCU now. It trades very heavily on the King Arthur mythology, British legends, magic, and characters like Merlin, traveling through time and the multiverse. So spoiler warning for the Eternals movie if you haven't seen it yet, because we have to talk about some big Black Knight plot points. During the Eternals movie, when the Eternals go back to the Domo, their spaceship in present day, they find that Makkari has been living there for centuries while they've all been living apart, and over that time, she's collected, hint, stolen, many priceless artifacts from across history and all the adventures that they had when they were still together. While they're having fun picking through her piles of treasure, Thena picks up a sword, swinging it around, remembering the period of history where they all lived in Camelot together with King Arthur, Lancelot, Merlin, and the Knights of the Round Table, and Sprite asks her if the sword she's playing with is the Ebony Blade, which is a huge Black Knight Easter egg. Because the original Black Knight comes from Camelot and the Ebony Blade was forged by Merlin, but then Thena says no, it's Excalibur, like the legendary Excalibur given to Arthur by the Lady in the Lake, meaning that all those legends were real historical events in the MCU, like King Arthur was a real person. In Big Doctor Strange connection, Merlin was the Sorcerer Supreme of his era. But bringing it back around to all the magical swords, while the Black Knight wields the Ebony Blade, Captain Britain wields Excalibur for a brief period, and we just saw Excalibur in the Eternals movie, as well as the Ebony Blade in that post-credit scene. Most of the time, though, Captain Britain's main weapons are the Amulet of Right and the Sword of Might. Just like Kit Harington's Dane Whitman Black Knight, Brian Braddock's Captain Britain comes from a powerful British family that goes back to the Middle Ages. His father was the previous version of Captain Britain. And when a new Captain Britain is selected, Merlin and his daughter Roma come to the new candidate and offer them a choice between the amulet and the sword. It's sort of a test of character, like the Holy Grail test in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Choosing the amulet represents the path of reason, while the sword represents the path of violence. Generally, Merlin tends to favor the people who choose the amulet, like you have chosen wisely, but you can still choose the path of violence, like pick the sword and become the next Captain Britain. The amulet and the sword are super powerful, but unlike the Black Knight, he doesn't only get his powers from the blade or the amulet. Most of his abilities are powered by interdimensional energies which are concentrated around the British Isles and Otherworld. Otherworld is this pocket dimension next to Earth where Avalon exists from the King Arthur mythology. It's this realm of really powerful magic where Merlin lives when he's not running around the main Marvel universe. Captain Britain's costume also kind of serves as a tether to this magical field that he draws his energy from. But basically, his powers are similar to Captain America's powers in that he has enhanced strength, stamina, durability, speed, but the amulet he wears also gives him a limited ability to fly. At this point in Marvel Phase 5, Marvel Phase 6, we're still trading very heavily on multiverse tropes. We have Deadpool and Wolverine, which literally involves the TVA from Loki Season 2 in many different universes, including a bunch of the X-Men, Fox, Marvel characters coming back. The Captain Britain stories, especially the more recent ones, trade heavily on multiverse tropes. For those of you that feel like the multiverse trope has gone on for too long, essentially Deadpool is the beginning of the end of that. That's why he's talking about rebooting the MCU, literally changing the Marvel Cinematic Universe during his trailer.
I smell what you're stepping in, Sensei. Your little cinematic universe is about to change forever.
You may remember a couple years ago, after Avengers Endgame came out, there were a couple rumors that we would see a version of Captain Britain in the upcoming movies. I think the idea right now is that they're doing Kit Harington's Black Knight character first as sort of a lead-in to the more mystical, fantasy-based sword and sorcery Marvel stories. And once they figure that out, like how to make it Game of Thrones, but set in present day with him crossing over with all the Avengers and Avengers 5 without it feeling silly or weird, and then they'll start doing more of those type of fantasy-based characters, because there is a lot of that inside the Marvel canon. I'm also really hoping for a Kit Harington Black Knight Disney Plus series, since they can use the extra episodes and room to just flesh out all that King Arthur mythology and backstory that they teased during the Eternals movie, and introduce the MCU Merlin and explain the history of the Ebony Blade and how the Eternals were connected to all that. The whole idea being that Merlin, being Sorcerer Supreme of his era, would be knowledgeable enough to understand that the Eternals were not human. So even if King Arthur didn't know what was going on with them, Merlin probably knew what was up with the Eternals. And it was just announced a little while ago that Marvel was using Kit Harington's Black Knight and Emilia Clarke's Gia from Secret Invasion to form a British Excalibur type of team, using them in the MCU, kind of like a British version of the Avengers, with Sonya Falsworth being kind of like a British Nick Fury. Hopefully that works out. That would be a pretty crazy Game of Thrones reunion for those two characters. Like, remember the last time we met, you actually killed me? They even had a big Game of Thrones reunion during the Eternals movie. They could also be bringing Henry Cavill in as a version of Captain Britain for this new Excalibur series to put him on this British version of the Avengers. For those of you hoping that the secret new character Henry Cavill is playing would be a version of Sentry or Hyperion, Deadline and some of the other trades have already reported that Marvel has cast Lewis Pullman from Top Gun Maverick as Sentry in the Thunderbolts movie. That could always change, but I think the idea is that they're going to make MCU Sentry sort of like a Super Saiyan version of a skinny nobody version of Robert Reynolds, and Henry Cavill is so swole, he's already like the Super Saiyan version of himself. And even though Hyperion would be super cool, I don't think Henry Cavill wants to be typecast as a Superman character, and Hyperion is basically like an evil version of Superman in the MCU. Because Homelander's already meant to be an evil parody of Superman, imagine if Homelander were actually an Eternal from another planet. That's basically Hyperion in the MCU. He could always show up during Eternals too if they wind up doing that movie, because they were looking for the other Eternals in the universe during that post-credit scene. But Hyperion was part of another group of Eternals on a different planet. His backstory on the planet and the circumstances of how he came to Earth are meant to be a parody of Superman's backstory and what happened with Krypton in the DC universe. He basically shows up on Earth claiming that his home planet was destroyed when secretly he was an Eternal, and early theory, his original planet just had an emergence with a Celestial being born which destroyed the planet, and like the Eternal's regular mission, he just moved on to the next planet with a Celestial that needed to be born afterwards and shows up on Earth claiming that he's a powerful alien. Even though we have Tiamat inside the Indian Ocean, basically he could still show up on Earth claiming that he was from a destroyed planet, quote unquote, when really it was just an emergence. They've actually used his character a lot during the animated series. Marvel could always do a version of Squadron Supreme at some point, but again, like I said, I think it's more likely Henry Cavill would try to avoid playing another type of Superman character, so he's probably not going to be Hyperion. Let me know in the comments though, who do you think that he is playing? If we hear more about that Excalibur TV show too, I will do more videos about it. There are a couple other Super Bowl trailers and bonus videos that I'm working on. We also just got a first look at the Punisher coming back during Daredevil Born Again, so I'll do a video for that footage next. Click here for that, I'll update the link as soon as I post it, and click here for all my Deadpool and Wolverine videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.